Hey everybody, welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields, and today we're on episode 7 of our Pints and Process series, where we're going to be talking about secondary and conditioning phase of your beer brewing. So we've gone through all of the other phases. We've already gone through fermentation in our last episode, and now we're on to whether or not you should transfer to a secondary and what are the pros and cons of doing so. So we're going to go through all of that after you hit that like and subscribe button right here. Grab yourself a pint, and we'll go through the process after this. All right, so why should you transfer to a secondary? Well, to be completely honest, it's actually optional to do so. And a lot of people choose not to do a secondary at all. There's nothing wrong with leaving your beer inside of the fermenter in your primary fermentation chamber, whatever that is, for an extended period of time. But there's also some benefits of doing so, right? And so essentially, in transferring your beer to a secondary will allow the beer to mellow out. It allows those flavors and aromas to start blending together, and it lets your yeast drop out of suspension, and it helps produce clearer beer. So all those proteins and hop particles and all that kind of stuff over time will mellow out in your beer. It'll also do that when it gets colder, and we'll talk about cold crashing a little bit later. One of the benefits of doing a secondary is having some time between having to bottle or keg your beer. And so if you are going to be gone, maybe you're going on vacation, maybe you're busy, and the next couple of weeks you really just won't have time to bottle or keg your beer, transferring it to a secondary quick will give you those additional couple of weeks. If you leave your beer sit on top of your yeast for too long, it can create some off flavors, and that starts happening at 3, 4, 5 weeks. And most home brewers don't leave their brew on a yeast cake that long, but you can if it's in a secondary and you've kind of getting it off that yeast cake. So the second kind of benefit of doing a secondary is adding adjuncts and fruits and hops and other things like spices or peppers or things like that in your homebrew. I have a whole video on how to add fruit and other adjuncts to your beer. I'm going to add that in the video description below. You can go check that out. Everything from adding fruits to, say, a blackberry sour like this one, to then adding other adjuncts, how to do for instance, a tincture for peppers that you might want to put in some type of a pepper beer. Those are things that you can do in your secondary, and you may not want to do that while you have your yeast still in there and browsing that stuff up as you're adding other things like, blackberries, for instance, have a lot of sugars. Well, I didn't want all of that yeast to be in there while I put the blackberries in there because it will really start up a new vigorous fermentation. And some of that's going to happen anyway. It's going to start fermenting a little bit when you have sugars added even to the secondary because there's some residual yeast left, but it'll get the primary trub and amount of yeast off of your beer, so you can add those other things in there. So in short here, it also has some cons, right? Some people don't like opening up their fermenter at all. There's some risk of contamination or oxidation of your beer. It's pretty small risk, especially if you have a good clean environment for your secondary. You're doing your cleaning and sanitizing. Some beers are more susceptible to oxidation. For instance, I transfer most of my beers to a secondary. However, I don't for a hazy IPA. I go right into cold crashing. I let it sit there for a little bit longer in the cold state, and then I transfer to a keg when I'm doing some type of a hazy IPA, just because that type of beer, for instance, is a little bit more prone to oxidation. But other than that, almost all of my beers, actually, I would say all of my other beers other than hazy IPAs, I transfer to a secondary every single time, and I've had phenomenal results. It also allows you to reuse the trub by transferring it to a secondary. So I use a lot of like WO01 or WLP01 from White Labs or US05 or what have you, right? Or maybe you're using a yeast that you don't use all that often, but you want to use again. So say you're doing a London Fog or some other hazy yeast that you're using. You can then take that yeast from the primary before you're going to dry hop a whole bunch of hops and other adjuncts on top of it. And after primary fermentation and you transfer it out, you'll have that trube on the bottom of your carboy. You can actually dump that into sanitized mason jars, and then you'll just put the lid very loosely on the top, and you'll put it in your refrigerator, and it'll help separate out some of that old beer and then the trube. And then you take that trube and you just after you decant off some of the old beer on the top, you can dump that whole trube right into your next beer, and it takes off like crazy. And breweries do this all the time. They use reused trube all the time. They don't really wash yeast all that much. And so transferring to a secondary allows you to take that trube and that sediment off the bottom of your carboy before you add a bunch more dry hops or other things that you might be wanting to do. If you do that in the primary, well, then you have all those other things that might be dropping to the bottom and kind of getting into your next beer. If it's not the exact same style, it could throw off the flavor of that next beer. And so it allows you to do that. And I reuse my trube quite often, so that's a big benefit, and it saves you a lot of money. It also gives you an opportunity to add gelatin or some other fining agent to your secondary. You can also do that to your you can also do that in your keg. So I have a video on how to add gelatin also. I'll put that in the link description. That is all about adding gelatin after it's already in the keg and you want clear beer to, say I have a competition, or maybe you want to have a, be correct to the beer style or whatever. Maybe you just want to see your beer crystal clear. You can add gelatin that way. So I'll put that again. So if you want to watch that in the linked video description below. So in summary, secondary fermentation is optional. It is something that you don't have to do. There's a lot of benefits of doing it, and a lot of people have dry hopping or they're adding other things to that secondary, and it gives you a little bit of time for your beer to kind of mellow out, chill out, do its thing. I think we've all probably taken a beer at one point or another after we brewed it, and we taste it and we're like, it's okay. But then like a couple days later, maybe even a couple weeks later, you crack another bottle or you pour another one on your keg and you're like, damn, this thing's fantastic. Because it needed that time to do its thing. It needed that time to condition and really mellow out. Hazy IPAs are notorious for kind of having hop burn and that kind of thing for right away, but you give them a couple of days and they're just juice bombs after that. And so if you try and pour that the first couple of days, you might get a little bit more of that astringent bitterness, perceived bitterness from the hops and stuff that quite haven't settled out yet. And so, but a few days later, they're amazing and they're awesome. So every beer needs to condition for a period of time. That secondary process and transfer to a secondary conditioning process helps that move along. So in short, I have a whole video on how to transfer to a secondary. So if you haven't done that before and you want to watch me go through a whole process of transferring one primary to a secondary, I'll have that also in the link description below. Please provide any comments, questions in the comments section. I love it. Answering questions is fun for me, and helping other brewers is the name of the game. So with that, hit that like and subscribe button. Cheers and happy brewing.